Right. Hey guys, Mr. Ridgway here. Hope you're doing well. Hope everything's going okay. As promised, here's our next lesson that is going to have to deal with the resurgence of the KKK, partially, and some other fun, as it says there, radical Red Scares. Now, with that, because today we're going to be talking about some pretty, as it says there, radical movements inside the United States. There's going to be something that I'm going to need to make sure before we go on that you have some background knowledge on. So the War and Peer is themed around that, and we have to talk about our first kind of chunk of the class is dedicated to the Red Scare of 1919. Now, red is a very famous 19-ish hundreds word slang thing for for communism. So with that, okay, before we can talk about the Red Scare and what all goes into that and what caused it and what happens because of it. We have to, first of all, I need to make sure that you understand why the U.S. is scared of things like the Red Scare and communism. So that's what this War and Peer is designed to do. So if you're doing this online and doing it on your own, you'll have to check this box off on your own and then kind of adjust your plans for this lesson accordingly, and I'll talk about that here in a second. So here's what the boxes say. I know what communism is and why the U.S. disagrees with it. Mentally check this box off, if I don't know what communism is and or why the U.S. disagrees with it. Okay, so if you don't know either one of those things, and again, that's perfectly okay. We're going to hopefully help meet you where you are in terms of what you're going to need here. Okay, so our main two objectives are really down here at the very bottom. And it says, explain the reasons for the start of the 1919 Red Scare and the reasons for its end, and then explain the reasons for why the KKK starts back up. We're gonna see that the KKK is gonna come back and in some ways stronger than ever. So before we get to all that, you'll see that I kind of have an arrow branching off of our lesson here, and it seems to be like we're skipping things possibly. There is the chance that if you feel like you're already very conversational with communism, like you could tell me what the proletariat is and the bourgeoisie and the Marxist understanding of history, skip the next roughly 10 or so minutes of the video, and I'll put a time link in the description down below so that you can do that. It'll be down there somewhere. If you feel like you don't know any of the words that I just said and you're like, Mr. Ridgway, you were throwing around French terms that I'm not sure what that means, then continue to keep watching the video. Okay, I'm going to get you hopefully the background knowledge that you need here so you can understand why the U.S. is so scared by communism as early as the 1920s. We're not even to the Cold War yet. So here we go. So if you don't know a thing about communism and you need some easy intro to why the U.S. dislikes it and what it's all about, feel free to take notes on your own on this. I'm not going to give you a note outline for it. But again, this is mostly just for you to be able to plug in the gaps that you might need to become, to get your communism 101, if you will. Okay, so we cannot talk about communism without talking about industrialization. And for Marx, those two things, Karl Marx, who's going to be the guy who invents this, these two things are inseparable. And so think about, just to even before we get to understanding where communism comes from, just think about the biggest event in this last unit that we talked about, and that's by far the Second Industrial Revolution. Think about all the changes that have happened in society. We mean immigration, labor unions, workers getting exploited, machines, railroads, oil, interchangeable parts, assembly lines, vertical integration. It just goes on and on and on and on, right? And with this kind of picture about what's going on in society, that brings us to the problems that go along with industrialization. Now, Marx is going to focus on this, as we will here too. This isn't to say that, of course, there's good things that happen with industrialization as well. Cheaper products that become more available, and consumer culture and all these fun things. However, we're going to talk about all the problems that have to go along with industrialization. So, first of all, industrialization, especially when it first occurs, is very, very messy and very disorganized. And by messy, I mean it's dangerous. Literally, like on the job, it's dangerous. There's child labor. It's just a sprawling mess. Is a good way to look at industrialization. A good example of this is like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which is this very famous fire that happens at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, and they just forgot to think of like, wait, what if a fire breaks out here? Like, what if should we have like a fire escape plan? And they're like, no. Mostly because they hadn't thought about the need for people to have an actual fire escape plan. So lots of people die in this. And again, that's not even getting to all the other horrible parts of industrialization, like child labor, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The point here that we're going to get to, and that Marx will get to, is that industrialization doesn't apply equally to everywhere. Okay, it's incredibly unequal in many ways. Women, minorities don't, if you're a part of these labor unions, you're often struggling for rights. And what happens with industrialization, and you can pull up graph after graph after graph after graph that shows you this, is that as time goes on, whether that's the first, the second, or the third industrial revolution with the internet, is that, either because of it or associated with it, social class differences expand. Okay, so let's get into why this has to do with Marx. So here is Mr. Marx here with his wonderful beard and hairstyle. If you've never met Karl Marx before, consider yourself now met with him. He is a German political philosopher. He lives about the end of the 1900s is when he's doing some of his most influential writing into the early 1900s, or into the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, excuse me. So Marx is not the only person writing about what's going on with the Industrial Revolution, but his voice certainly becomes the most prominent. He is part of this movement that is a growing critique of all of these problems that are emerging out of industrialization. And Marx, as a German political philosopher would do, is going to propose an alternative vision for what he thinks should exist besides capitalism. And this is something called socialism. Okay. Now, it tends to today that we're going to talk here about old school, like Marxian socialism and communism. We tend today to throw it, like you hear these words like, oh, he's a socialist, or she's a socialist, like thrown around. That has a very, very different meaning today. And it's kind of, in some words, gone through what we call, it's called linguistic bleaching. Where it just doesn't have like the same oomph that it does anymore. The thing is that Marx is going to have a very particular view, which we're going to go and explore here for a second. Now, before I get too ahead of myself, if you're not familiar with capitalism, okay, capitalism, we're just going to keep it really simple here, is an economic system where you as a private individual, you want to make money on something we call the market, right? You want to be able to buy and sell goods and make a profit. And that's a pretty easy way to understand capitalism. Let's then try to dive into what Marx says is the alternative, okay? So here's what Marx's lens into the world is. Marx says that if we look at industrialization, the inequality that comes out of it is because there is a struggle in ownership between two groups over what are called the means of production. So the means of production, very simply, are your ability to make stuff. And there's lots of things that fall into this category. It could be, it could be whether or not you have access to the labor to do it, or the supplies, or the money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what Marx says, okay, that all that history is, Marx argues, is that history is just a long series of economic conflict between the two groups, those who do have access and hold on to the means of production, and those who do not. Okay, as they're also called then the haves and the have-nots. Now, he actually gives a name to these two groups. The bourgeoisie is this means of production owning class, and the proletariat is the not. Okay, to put this in like Bernie Sanders terms for you non-boomers to be able to understand this, it's like the 1% versus the 99%. Okay, and what Marx basically says is that as time goes on, there's conflict between these two groups, and every single time there's conflict, we get a new stage of history. And eventually, what Marx says is going to happen is that there will hit a point where the proletariat, okay, will rise up and seize the means of production from the bourgeoisie, and then at that point, those means of production will get redistributed, okay, to people according to their need. And so you're going to hit this moment of equality. Okay, this idea of I'm going to do something out of greed to make myself better than somebody else is going to disappear. So again, I know for those of you who are really deep into the Marx, I'm probably butchering this, but we're just trying to be conversationally fluent here. So if you're curious, by the way, here's what Marx says were the stages of history. And you can see there we have our, on the left, our bourgeoisie class versus on the right, our proletariat classes. And what Marx argued is that history worked through 6 stages, and that at the time Marx was writing, they were in their 4th stage. Without getting too crazy into this, eventually the end game here is something Marx called communism, which is ironically in some ways what communism never becomes, but we can get to that later. And in communism, Marx says eventually the idea of class differences fades away because everybody gets what they need, according to that lens, and also then if everybody gets what they need, then there's also no need for government, and so government also disappears, and that's what Marx called communism. So, why does the U.S., when this ideology comes about in the early 1900s, why is the U.S. so vigorously opposed to this? It has to do with a couple things. Mostly it goes down to ethics and philosophy. The U.S. doesn't agree with the ideals of communism. So let's do a little compare-contrast here. Now, of course, this isn't to say that the U.S. doesn't believe in some of these things. It's just that it seems that generally speaking, the U.S. tends to prefer the former of these things that we're going to talk about. So for the U.S., it tends to be that we often value freedom over equality. Okay, and again, in a pure Marxian communist system, perfect equality is what would be achieved there, right? We want the freedom to be able to do A, B, or C, whether that makes us better than somebody else or not. Okay. Capitalism versus socialism. Okay, human beings, the United States would probably believe, like the ability to make their own money. Versus in Marx, where it would be, for instance, the government providing what people need early on, and then eventually just everybody would live in a classless society where everybody gets what they need, with no ifs, ands, or buts. Then in the United States, I think most people would probably agree with the idea that human beings are at least self-interested in some capability. We're greedy, put another way. And in communism, you have to understand, if you want to reach this perfect Marxian state of right here, okay, where everybody would have the ability and equal ownership of the means of production. Everybody has what they need, and there's no competition over that. You would have to have this moment in communism where human beings were capable of having no self-interest at all. Because the moment where somebody would have self-interest over somebody else, that wouldn't be a truly pure communist system. And the U.S. would, and again, this isn't to say that, of course, there's moments where we do things that are not in our self-interest, or we do things that are based on equality. But again, the U.S. tends to prefer these things over others sometimes. Okay, so if you can understand, it's kind of about freedom and capitalism and the idea that we want human beings to be able to pursue their own interest. There you go. That's kind of some of the philosophical basis for why the U.S. doesn't like communism, which then brings us to talking about some changes. So what I'd like you to do before you go on the rest of the lesson, we'll do this in class, is we're going to take a moment to look back and talk about just all the different kinds of changes that have happened since the Civil War up to 1920. I'm going to have you in class do this with a group of people. If you're doing this on your own, I'm sorry, you'll have to do this on your own. I think the best way to do this is to probably look back at the titles of the lessons that we've done and to use those as brainstorms for changes that have happened. If you're looking for other ways to think about what have happened, I've got a little acronym down here, SPICE, that can give you some different lenses as to like, oh yeah, that was a political change we talked about, or oh yeah, that was a social change, or an environmental change we talked about, or economic change. So brainstorm as many as you possibly can on like a piece of paper would be totally fine. And take about 3-4 minutes to do so. Once you've come up with all that you can, move on with me and we'll talk about why we just did this. Okay? So we just talked about all those changes, and you hopefully wrote something down. You might have put the Great Migration down there. You might have put the Second Industrial Revolution. It could, labor unions. It goes on and on and on and on, right? About all these changes that we've talked about. And with that, then, that is going to lead us into the Red Scare of 1919. Okay, so what I've got for you, okay, is going to be a choose-your-own-journey game about this Red Scare. And one of the reasons why the Red Scare happens is because of those changes that you just listed down there. And what we're going to see here, okay, is that you are going to play in this game as the Attorney General for the United States. This is like the United States' like top lawyer, okay, for the federal government. So what you're going to get here is a series of scenarios that could be indicative of a plot by communists in the United States. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. And you're going to have to look at some of the evidence and some of the sources that are presented to you, and you're going to have to decide, are you going to label this plot, this incident, this whatever it is that you encounter, are you going to label it a communist plot, or are you not going to? And as the Attorney General, you have not only the obligation to do so, but then obviously you're gonna share those findings with the American people, right? You work for them. But be aware, whether you choose to label something communist or not is going to have implications. So let's get to that. Okay, so let's kind of hit the kind of pin down where the tension's going to lie here. So as it's hinted, it's called the Red Scare of 1919. We have to talk about the fear that Americans have of a communist plot somehow happening inside the United States. The question for you as the Attorney General is going to be, if you declare an incident a communist plot, are you going to scare and freak average Americans out that, oh my gosh, communists are infiltrating the United States? Or maybe, perhaps you are rightly so doing that. Maybe there really are. Or, okay, are you going to make the decision that, no, this is clearly not communism. You're going to tamp down on fear, and maybe people acknowledge you and appreciate you for doing that because maybe there's no evidence at all. Or could that leave them with the feelings that, hey, you're not addressing our fears and this is clearly a problem. Aren't you going to take care of this? And they're going to get even more paranoid. So tough decisions to make here. Okay. Here's the game. Okay, right here it says play, sing, write a choose your own adventure game, choose your own journey game. And then right here, okay, there's something called chart your score, and then this one says reflect. So I'm going to go into the game and just give you a little preview of it here. And I'm just going to kind of skip ahead. I'm going to cheat so you can actually see a screen that you will end with. Okay, so there's a lot of introduction. Please make sure you read it. Okay, and when you get to the very end of the game, and there's multiple different endings, okay, I'm just going to show you here one screen that you'll end on. Okay, you'll see that there's some scores down at the bottom, and this game will custom score you based on a couple of things. The first is going to be accuracy. Did you actually do what the Attorney General really did do in 1919? Then you're going to get two other scores, and the first is going to be an oppressiveness score, and the other one is going to be a paranoia score. Oppressiveness is how harsh you're being, okay, like how hard you're cracking down on the communist plots or not, quote unquote. Paranoia is how freaked out your citizens are getting in the United States. What you're going to do is when you get to the very end of your particular ending that you end up with, depending on your choices, you're going to get, an oppressiveness score and a paranoia score. And so if I go back here, okay, you're going to see it's going to say chart your score. So you're going to click there, and you're going to, put your block in, type your last name, okay, and you're just going to put some data in. So, for example, you see on there, I scored a 10 and I scored a 10 for both. And then I hit submit, and it says, go back to our slide to check out the next Google form. Your data will now show up. And it says, thanks, Yukami. Awesome. Okay, let's go back, and it says now reflect. So what's really cool about this is I'm going to now put my information in over here, okay? And you can see that, hey, look at that. We've now got some data that we can look at. And this actually is coming from our class, which is really cool, okay? So we've got this, we've got our data now that we can operate off of, and it might take a minute to update. We'll see if it updated. Okay, I'll have to go make sure it should update for you as people turn in their scores. And then I've got a couple of questions here that I'd like you to answer. The first question, what is the relationship between enforcement and paranoia? Okay, or oppressiveness and paranoia. I'll make sure that I change that wording for you. Let's go ahead and do that now. Make sure I fix that. So what's the relationship between oppressiveness and paranoia? And once you've answered that, okay, you might want to think of it as like a positive or negative relationship. I'd like you to kind of think about that. And then we get this other question that's right here. And it says, looking at the actual number of communist-inspired conspiracies that happened from 1917 to 1919 in the U.S., was the paranoia of American citizens and actions by the U.S. government justified? Explain why or why not. And then I would encourage you to think about two answers. Write about one answer from our perspective in our current year, and then from our perspective of somebody living in 1917 to 1919. You might get a couple different answers there. So I'm interested to hear what you say there. And again, I'll make sure that graph live updates for you guys and does the thing it's supposed to do. Once you've done that, and again, I apologize for this video being long, you can now head on to the reincarnation of the KKK. So we're going to look at why does it reincarnate, and then also what was its influence in the Midwest. Okay. By the way, the previous objection, it says explain the reasons for the start of the 1919 Red Scare and the reasons for its end. You will find those reasons inside the Choose Your Own Journey game. So make sure that, again, you take note of those before you go on. Okay, cool. All right, it's time. Reincarnation of the KKK. It's back. It's hit its downloadable content. It's in its final form. Almost. Okay, so how do hate groups represent or magnify, or do they represent or magnify the concerns of a society? And then how do politics, race, and ethnicity affect decisions and policies made by local people and governments? Okay, so the reasons for why we get the second KKK. Oh boy. So all those changes that you guys wrote down for the Red Scare, hey, look at that. They're also going to apply to the reasons why we also get the KKK. A little bit different, but from the same vein of thought. And that is just the sheer amount of ethno-cultural changes that the United States has gone through since 1865. Let's deal with the ones that are going to concern the KKK primarily. The first are going to be the massive waves of immigrants that have come from Southern and Eastern Europe. And in particular, Catholics, Jews, and Slavic peoples, and we'll talk about why those groups matter here in a second. The second big oomph for the rebirth of the KKK is the Great Migration, which again was the migration of hundreds of thousands of Black Americans starting in about the World War I time period up through World War II. And again, they mostly early on go to Midwestern cities in the first waves of it. The other reason that we're going to get the KKK is the rise of what we call WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans, and this need that they are going to feel with these groups that we just talked about to protect Americanism from otherness. And we often call this this like fear of otherness or fear of alien influence. Again, we call this nativism or xenophobia. Okay, so with that then, that is going to bring us then to the KKK and who restarted it and what was it. So please watch this video right here. Okay, if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll have to go and dig into the slide and then click it. And then please summarize it for me in 3 hashtags. Okay. So let's talk about then, once you've watched that, what the ideals of the reborn KKK are. Okay. First, 100% Americanism, which it's hard to define exactly what that is. Maybe in some cases it's easier to define what that isn't. And that is the lesser influence of very particular groups. The Klan in the 1920s goes after even more than they did. Of course, people of color are going to be their target, but it's going to specifically go after Catholics, Jews, immigrants, and also African Americans. The goals of the Klan, besides that, and trying to reduce the influence of those groups, in many cases terrorizing them, is to raise money and elect Klan-backed politicians to change local and statewide laws. And you knew, living in like Detroit or Indianapolis or Chicago and other areas, you knew who your local Klan politicians were. They were just well known. So if we look here about what the ideals and the concerns of the KKK are, the second time around, this is the founder William J. Simmons warning about the melting pot ideal of the United States. He says, quote, "It's a garbage can. When the hordes of aliens walk to the ballot box and our votes outnumber yours, then that alien horde has got you by the throat." Yikes. So, let's talk about the North and the numbers of the KKK. Okay, the KKK takes off like wildfire in the 1920s, and it becomes immensely popular in the Midwest. And again, why? Think about where most of these changes have been happening, whether it's immigration or the Great Migration, and the list goes on and on and on, right? They've been mostly happening in big cities in the North. And so if you look here, in 1925, membership in the Klan hits 5 million, at least that's the estimates that we have, such as in cities like Indy, Chicago, Detroit, et cetera, et cetera. I have a question, though, here for you, and I'll let this reveal the answer. Why do you think it's difficult for us to determine how many members were a part of the KKK overall? And again, speaking here specifically in the 1920s. So there's an answer here that will reveal it to you, but only if you click and then reveal the answer. Also, then I've got a quote here by Kevin Boyle, who did a really, really good, really amazing book called Arc of Justice that I recommend you check out. But this is him talking about the KKK and how influential it's in Detroit. So he talks about the first Klan organizer had come to Detroit in 1921, just as the organization was trying to push its base into the urban North. He spent the next year spreading the carefully crafted message of moral renewal, 100% Americanism, anti-unionism, anti-Catholicism, anti-Semitism, and racism, a more overt, cruder version of the politics that the Detroit News had vainly employed against Murphy, who's another guy that was fighting against the KKK. Moving on. Okay, so great was the reception, the Klan could barely keep up with the flow of recruits. By 1923, there were 22,000 Klansmen in Detroit, and the Invisible Order was ready to go public. Throughout the summer, the KKK held nighttime rallies on the far west side, complete with cross burning so spectacular and speeches so incendiary, they drew upward of 8,000. Klan newsboys took to selling the organization's newspaper, The Fiery Cross, on street corners, and on Christmas Eve in 1923, Klansmen marked the season by burning a 6-foot-tall cross in front of City Hall, then cheering a hooded Santa Claus who has come to entertain the kids. Wow, right? So they're very public. Let's talk about the impact that the Klan has on society and government. The Klan and those who sympathize with their ideas, Okay, not necessarily Klan members themselves, but those who were sympathizers or may have ascribed to some of the ideals that were being pushed by the KKK. The KKK's impact on society and government, whether it's them or, again, sympathizers, is really profound. First of all, the KKK is immensely talented at raising money and getting local officials elected to office. And the impacts that are from them, that whether they're, again, inspired by the KKK or just the nativist message that was kind of flowing around the time, are really, really strong. The first thing that we're going to get out of this big nativist push that happens, again, in the 1910s, 1920s, is first the creation of urban ghettos. And this is going to happen because of multiple things. Let's first of all talk about what we mean by an urban ghetto. So realtors, neighbors, and neighborhood associations work very much in concert with each other to keep these others out of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant areas. So one of these practices that becomes very publicly well known and documented and pushed is something called redlining. Okay, so what redlining is that appraisers of these neighborhoods and of property values and what they would do, okay, is that these people, along with city officials, they would draw these maps that were color coded, and they would designate certain neighborhoods as bad or rough, which was code words for black. And then what would happen then is that they would draw these red lines around them, okay, and the property values, of course, in these areas, when they're drawn that way on maps and known to realtors and, you know, who are selling houses there, is that it drops property values incredibly hard. And also, trying to then buy a house in one of these redlined areas becomes immensely difficult because it's hard for families to get loans, and because it's hard for them to get loans and, you know, have houses that can build equity over time and build up value over time. It's hard for them to start businesses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this has immensely profound effects on black livelihood in the North for generations to come. So there's a video there that I highly encourage you to check out. It's an Adam Ruins Everything on redlining, and please watch it. Also, other effects that this nativist mentality is going to have is police brutality, riots, just killings with very few to no repercussions. I would encourage you, if you have free time, to go look at the Tulsa massacre that happens there with Black Wall Street. Very similar vein of thought here. Mobs and race riots, deaths on both sides, of course, but obviously not justice there, not merited out equally. Okay, so once you complete the exit ticket, then that kind of gets us to the re-rise of the KKK. And to kind of put a cap on this lesson, as I'm realizing this is a really long video, the KKK will die out, the second version of it, but it will take a lot longer to die than the first one did, because the first one, again, dies when Reconstruction's over. The second one takes a long time. It kind of how it basically ends is it kind of fractures between, as kind of some groups disagree, and it kind of breaks up over that. And then eventually, by the time that we get to our modern day KKK, it's kind of fractured into even more disparate groups that are very hard to keep track of. So with that, there's an exit ticket there. That'll end our lesson, and I hope you guys enjoyed this lesson. I'll see you guys in our next one where we can talk about jazz. So see you later.